every late night spent staring at the ceiling and worrying about inventory. I built the dealership, Sterling Auto Group, from a damp garage and a handshake. Now it was Michael's. My son. At least, that is what he told everyone, what he believed. The house was too quiet during the week, but on Sundays they filled it up with noise, complaints, and the hollow sound of forced laughter. I sat at the head of the table, a figurehead, a decoration that smelled faintly of Bengay and old money. My daughter-in-law, Sarah, kept glancing at the keys resting beside my water glass. They were the keys to the Bentley. My Bentley. The car I bought myself after 40 years of work. She started it, of course. "Dad," she said, her voice dripping with artificial sweetness, "Michael and I had a talk about the drive over here today." I looked up. Michael wouldn't meet my eyes. He was busy carving the roast beef, looking important with the knife in his hand. A man of purpose. "What about the drive, Sarah?" I asked. My voice was weaker than I remembered it being. "Well, nothing serious. Nothing at all," she chirped. "But you clipped the curb pulling out of the driveway, Richard." Michael noticed. "Just a tiny scrape." It wasn't a scrape. It was a slight bump. I was watching a pedestrian, but the details customer. "You almost hit the mail truck last week, Richard," Sarah insisted, folding her arms. And remember the incident with the garage door sensor. They catalogued my failures. My tiny stumbles were magnified into proof of irreversible decline. They had been collecting evidence for months. They wanted control. They wanted the freedom of knowing I couldn't simply leave. They wanted the house, eventually. But first, they wanted my independence locked down. "I am perfectly capable of driving," I stated, pushing back my chair. I felt a cold surge of indignation, the kind that had fueled 40 years of ambition. "We know you are capable, Dad," Michael sighed, as if explaining gravity to a child. "But you're becoming a liability. We've talked to the insurance agency. They're getting nervous." A liability. That was the word that struck deepest. I wasn't just old. I was a risk to their carefully constructed, leveraged lives. They had been planning this moment. Michael reached across the table, swiftly, before I could react. His hand closed around the key fob, lifting it. He didn't ask. He didn't negotiate. He just took it. "This is temporary, Dad," he said, holding the keys up high. The light caught the chrome logo. "We're going to get you set up with a driver, a reliable one, until you can prove you're back to 100%. Back to 100%. A measure they knew I could never reach again. The taking of the keys was a physical violation, but the insult that followed was the wound that bled internally. "Besides," Sarah added, leaning closer, her voice dropping to a conspiratorial whisper meant to be heard by everyone except perhaps the hired help, "if you're going to be so clumsy with the parking, we can't risk that car being totaled. It's part of the estate now, isn't it?" Clumsy. The grandchildren chuckled nervously, sensing the victory of the parents. I didn't argue. I didn't scream. I had learned, over 80 years, that true power doesn't raise its voice. I simply watched Michael place my keys into his own pocket, right next to his wallet. He patted the pocket. Secure. I stood up, pushing my chair back slowly. The sound echoed in the suddenly silent dining room. "Excuse me," I murmured. "I think I'll go rest now." Michael tried to look sympathetic. "Good idea, Dad. I'll bring you up a slice of pie later." I walked up the grand staircase alone. Each step was an effort, but I wasn't tired from walking. I was tired from fighting. When I reached the hallway, I could hear them settling back down at the table, discussing me in hushed, satisfied tones. The problem was handled. I went into my study. The mahogany desk felt solid beneath my hands. This room held the true record of my life, not the silver frames downstairs displaying Michael's diplomas. I sat down and looked out the window. I could see the city lights beginning to blur in the late afternoon smog. Clumsy. Liability. They thought they had taken my mobility. But what they had really done was take the final shred of my goodwill. They had mistaken my quietness for weakness, my retirement for senility. I founded Sterling Auto Group 50 years ago. Michael had been running the day-to-day operations for the last 15, signing the checks, giving the motivational speeches. He believed he was the architect. He didn't know I still owned the property the flagship dealership sat on, all 3 acres. He leased it from a holding company, a very, very private holding company. He didn't know I still held the majority silent stake in the investment consortium that financed their entire inventory line. He didn't know that my legal trust, established in 1995, had provisions that made his family dependent on my explicit annual signature for accessing the major dividend payouts. I reached for the heavy phone on the corner of the desk, not my cell phone, which Sarah had tried to teach me how to use 5 different times. This phone was different. It connected directly to 3 people, no intermediaries. The first number was for Arthur Finch, my attorney. He had handled every hostile takeover and complex dissolution I had ever faced, starting in 1978. Arthur never asked questions. He just listened, then executed. I heard the line click. "Arthur," I said. My voice was steady now. The tremor was gone. It had been replaced by a slow, burning frost. "Richard, to what do I owe the call?" I bypassed the pleasantries. "Arthur, I need you to pull up the documentation for the Sterling Auto Group land lease. Parcel 4B. "Ah, the Michael situation," Arthur replied. He knew everything. "The Michael situation escalated today. I am no longer interested in waiting until I die to settle matters." I paused, breathing deeply. I could picture Michael downstairs, enjoying his pie, the keys to my life tucked safely in his pocket. "They called me clumsy, Arthur," I whispered. A pause on the other end. Arthur understood the language of motivation better than anyone. "I need you to prepare the notice of termination," I instructed him. "Immediate effect. They are to vacate the property within 60 days. No exceptions for the inventory." This was necessary, but it wasn't the final move. It was the lever. "And, Arthur," I continued, leaning closer to the phone, "I want you to call the acquisition director at Kratos Automotive Holdings. They have been wanting that prime lot for years. Get me the standing offer they made in November." Arthur cleared his throat. "Richard, that offer was substantial. Are you serious about selling?" Michael will read about it in the morning," I stated firmly. "He will find out what it means to be a true liability." I hung up the phone. The first step was complete. The dealership, the centerpiece of my son's identity, the reason they had tolerated me for the last decade, was about to become an unsecured asset. It was time to remind them that when you call the man who built the empire clumsy, you risk watching him dismantle it. I walked to the safe, hidden behind the painting of the old hunting dogs. I opened it and retrieved the small blue leather-bound folder. Inside was the final, signed version of my will. The one Michael and Sarah thought they had already reviewed. The one they thought was ironclad in their favor. They were wrong. I needed one more thing before the night was over. I reached for the second dedicated line, the one that connected me directly to my bank manager in Geneva. It was midnight there, but he would answer. He always answered. The financial lever was heavy. I needed to ensure the transfer was immediate. When the hammer dropped, I wanted the deed already signed and the funds offshore. I would make the call now, and when the sun rose, they would find that the dealership Michael thought he owned, the source of his entitlement, was already gone. They called me clumsy, but tonight I was going to teach them the true meaning of severance. My keys were still in Michael's pocket, but the keys to their future I still held those. And tonight, I was going to use them to lock them out completely. The transfer instructions would take 20 minutes. 20 minutes to wipe out 50 years of presumption. I picked up the receiver. It was time to begin. They thought that moment, when Mark tossed the keys into his work bag, was the end of the conversation. They thought the matter was settled. They left the living room, the keys jangling softly, almost mocking me, from the hallway closet where they now hung. They had called me clumsy. They had treated me like a child who might wander into traffic. The silence that settled over the house was heavy, far heavier than the sound of the engine starting up the next morning when they left for the dealership. I realized then what they had truly stolen. Not just the ability to drive, but the basic right to leave. My world shrank instantly. Before, if I wanted coffee, I drove to the old diner downtown. I talked to friends. I was a man moving through his own life. Now, if I wanted a specific type of tea, I had to ask Sarah. If I needed a prescription refilled, I had to wait until Mark was available. Usually, that meant waiting until Monday. They controlled the groceries. They controlled the schedule. They controlled my mobility entirely. It was a cage built out of convenience and disguised as concern. They called it safety. I called it solitary confinement. The worst part was watching them interact with each other, oblivious to the volcano they were sitting on. Mark would come home from work, often late, complaining about the staff. He would pour himself a scotch, proud of his general manager title. "Tough day, Dad," he'd say, stretching on the sofa. The inventory reports were a mess, but I sorted it out. That dealership relies on me. He was magnificent in his self-importance. He never knew that every single profit margin he boasted about, every bonus he took pride in, was directly signed off by a corporate entity he had never heard of. The financial structure was a masterpiece of legal obscurity, designed decades ago for tax efficiency and extreme privacy. Mark and Sarah managed the day-to-day sales floor. They were highly paid employees. They believed they were the inheritors, the masters of the domain. They were just highly visible tenants. Their casual cruelty deepened quickly once they knew I was trapped. A few days later, I had a specialist appointment scheduled downtown. Crucial one. I had been planning this appointment for months. I politely reminded Sarah the night before. She looked up from her phone, barely acknowledging me. "Oh, Arthur, we can't take you tomorrow. Mark has an early client meeting, and I need to review payroll." "But this is important," I insisted, trying to keep the tremor out of my voice. "I need to go." She sighed, a loud theatrical noise that signaled I was being a nuisance. "Look, we told you that we would handle things now. If you had been more responsible, we wouldn't be in this situation. You're clumsy, remember? We can reschedule. It's just an appointment." "You're clumsy, remember?" That phrase, the reminder of the justification for their theft, hit harder than any physical blow. They weren't just restricting my life, they were redefining me based on their petty lie. I retreated to my room. The humiliation was a hot pressure behind my eyes. I sat there until midnight, listening to the muffled sounds of their television. They were comfortable. They felt secure. They felt powerful. And that was exactly the time to dismantle their security. I hadn't needed to touch the inner workings of the business in over a decade. My trust was managed by discreet professionals in 3 different states. The dealership was owned by Arlington Holdings LLC. Arlington Holdings was entirely owned by a private family trust. The only name on the family trust documents, the one and only principal settler, was mine, Arthur Vance. I didn't own the dealership in my personal name. I owned the trust that owned the holding company, that owned the land, the buildings, and the entire inventory Mark and Sarah were currently selling. It was necessary to be silent. It was necessary to be invisible. I waited until 2 a.m. when the house was truly quiet. I went down to the old study. the room they never used, thinking it was just dusty storage. I unlocked the safe hidden behind the built-in bookshelf. The lock mechanisms clicked softly. Inside were old deeds, private banking statements, and a single heavily encrypted laptop. I powered it up. The glow felt familiar, like greeting an old, powerful friend. I didn't look at the spreadsheets of inventory or the daily sales goals. I went straight to the long-term investment portfolios. The dealership was profitable, extremely so, but it was only one asset in a much larger global ledger. It was time to liquidate that asset. It took me an hour to draft the initial instructions, precise, cold, and utterly devoid of emotion. I listed the dealership as an immediate asset disposal, high priority, confidentiality paramount. I added a secondary instruction. Mark and Sarah Vance were to be notified only after the sale was finalized and the closing papers were filed. They would walk in one morning and find a new sign, new locks, and new management. I found the contact information for Mr. Henderson. He wasn't a family lawyer. He was a professional trustee specialized in discreet, high-value asset transfers. I hadn't spoken to him in years, but his encrypted line was still active. It took 3 rings. "Henderson," a crisp voice answered. "It's Arthur," I whispered into the phone, the sound of my own name feeling foreign and powerful. A pause, a slight change in his breathing. "Mr. Vance, we rarely hear from you." "I need to move some assets, Henderson, immediately, starting with the dealership on Elm Street." "All of it?" "Mark and Sarah's location?" he asked neutrally. "Yes, they are employees, Henderson. Treat them as such. I want the sale finalized within 30 days. No public notice. Use your connections. Find the fastest, cleanest buyer willing to pay above market." "Understood, Mr. Vance. And the proceeds?" "The proceeds are to be funneled directly back into the primary trust. And Henderson—" I paused, letting the silence hang. "I need the locks on this house changed simultaneously, effective the day the sale closes." I heard the scratch of his pen on paper, thousands of miles away. "Consider it done, Mr. Vance." I closed the laptop and placed it back in the safe. I locked the bookshelf door. I was no longer the clumsy old man who needed his children's permission to go to the store. I was the principal settler. I was the chairman. And tomorrow, when Mark went to his desk, ready to sell cars, he wouldn't know that the very ground beneath his feet was already being exchanged for cold, hard cash. The game had changed, and they were about to realize that calling the shepherd clumsy was a mistake when the shepherd controlled the entire flock. The silence in the house that evening was heavier than usual. It was the kind of silence that happens when disrespect is served cold, and everyone knows they have crossed a line, but only one person feels the actual bruise. I sat in my study, the room they rarely entered. It smelled of old paper and dust, a protective barrier against their shiny, modern ambitions. They had called me clumsy. They had treated me like a child needing supervision. But it wasn't the car keys that hurt the most. It was the easy assumption of their right to control me, the swift, confident dismissal of my competence. They forgot that the man they called clumsy was the man who built the roof over their heads, the man who, 40 years ago, had sunk every penny he had and some he didn't into a small lot and a handful of used pickup trucks. That lot became the foundation. That foundation became the empire they were now running. I looked at the locked safe, hidden behind a bookshelf. They knew I had a safe. They assumed it contained my will, the outdated pension papers, and maybe some old war medals. They assumed it contained their inheritance. They didn't realize it contained the legal structures that still placed every critical decision firmly in my hands. I opened the safe. The mechanism clicked, a sound far louder than the laughter I had heard downstairs earlier. I pulled out a thick, faded blue folder. Inside were the documents that detailed the actual ownership of the Miller Automotive Group. My son, Robert, operated the business day to day. He oversaw the inventory, managed the sales teams, and believed utterly and completely that the company was his. His name was on the operational agreements, yes. He was CEO. But ownership is not the same as management. Years ago, I had established a complex structure, a holding company managed by an independent trust. I was the sole beneficial owner of that trust, a structure designed not to avoid taxes, as they assumed, but to protect the business from volatile market whims, and I now realized from volatile family whims. The structure meant that while Robert ran the showrooms, I held the pen that could sign away the entire operation. He never asked about the intricacies. Why should he? He was too busy cashing the bonuses that the dealership paid him. He only cared about the glossy quarterly reports. He treated the foundation like stable ground, never realizing I could pull the earth right out from under him. I sat for an hour, reviewing the clauses. The language was cold, precise, and absolute. It gave me, the sole beneficial owner, the complete right to liquidate or sell the holding company at any time. Providing reasonable notice was given to the management, which in this case was Robert. I put the folder down. The shame of the afternoon crystallized into a hard, cold decision. This wasn't about teaching them a lesson in manners. This was about asserting the right to live my remaining years with dignity. If they required me to be powerless to feel powerful, then I required them to understand the true cost of their perception. I reached for the phone, the old landline. I bypassed my cell phone, which Robert insisted I use for emergencies, and which he probably monitored. This needed to be silent. I dialed the number of Miss Davis, my financial lawyer. She was the only person besides myself who understood the full depth of the company's architecture. It was 8 in the evening. Miss Davis was professional, always answering, no matter the hour. "Frank, is everything all right?" Her voice was sharp with immediate concern. She knew I only called her when the stakes were high. "It is time, Miss Davis," I said, my voice steady. It surprised even me how calm I sounded, like I was ordering milk, not dismantling my life's work. "Time for what, Frank? The endowment review?" she asked. "No, time to sell the dealerships." The line went silent. I could hear the faint sound of traffic outside her office window, even through the speaker. "Frank, are you certain? This is the Miller Automotive Group. Your legacy. Robert is running it exceptionally well, according to the quarterly reports." "He runs it well," I conceded, "but he doesn't respect the owner. And when the owner is disrespected, the structure fails." I briefly recounted the incident with the keys. I didn't raise my voice. I just laid out the facts. The humiliation, the condescending tone, the theft of my control. Miss Davis listened patiently. When I finished, she cleared her throat. "I understand, Frank, a profound lack of respect, but selling an asset this size is disruptive and complex." "I know it is disruptive, Miss Davis, but I want it done immediately." I then reminded her of the specific clauses that allowed for rapid transfer. "I want you to activate the quiet sale protocol we discussed 5 years ago, the one for irreconcilable differences in long-term strategy." She understood instantly. The quiet sale protocol. This was the blueprint for an expedited private liquidation to a known competitor who had long expressed interest. A competitor who knew the business was solid and simply wanted the market share. "Frank, that process moves very quickly. It uses the pre-vetted buyer, Hudson Auto Group. Once the formal letter of intent is signed, the deal could close within 30 days. Are you prepared for the fallout?" I leaned back in my chair, looking at the ceiling, where a ghost of paint from when the house was new still shimmered. "I am prepared. Miss Davis, what are the first steps?" She detailed the immediate actions. "Drafting the internal documents, contacting Hudson, preparing the non-disclosure agreements. She promised to have the preliminary paperwork ready for my signature by tomorrow morning. Do not inform Robert or anyone in the management chain until the letter of intent is secured and binding. I want this done silently. If they knew, they would try to block it, legally or otherwise. Understood, Frank. Complete discretion. Tomorrow, 10 o'clock sharp, my office. I hung up the phone. My hand trembled slightly, not from fear, but from the realization of the absolute power I held, which I had never before chosen to wield against my own blood. The next morning, Robert left early as usual to go to his dealership. He didn't check on me. He didn't offer breakfast. My daughter-in-law, Martha, paused only long enough to inform me that she had taken the liberty of disconnecting the Wi-Fi in my study because she needed the bandwidth for a work meeting in the kitchen. Another small casual removal of my comfort. "Don't spend too long fussing with that file box, Dad," she called sweetly, unaware I was dressing to sell the engine of their entire lives. The drive to Miss Davis's office was tense. I took a cab. It felt strange not driving myself, but I accepted the necessity. The key incident was a humiliation, but it also provided the perfect cover. I was the clumsy old man now confined to the house, definitely not out negotiating multi-million-dollar corporate mergers. When I arrived, the room was quiet and focused. Miss Davis had 2 thick binders waiting. Hudson Auto Group confirmed. Their continued interest within the hour, Frank. They are ready to move. This is the official letter of intent. It confirms their purchase price, the timeline, and the transfer of all assets, effective immediately upon closing. The number on the page was staggering. A powerful valuation that validated every year of work I had poured into the company. It was more money than any of us could ever spend. But the money was irrelevant. It was the principle. "Is this binding once I sign?" I asked, looking at the space where I had to place my signature. "Absolutely binding. Once we deliver this, the clock starts. Robert will be informed only when the closing date is secured. He will have roughly 2 weeks' notice of the change of ownership." I picked up the pen. It was heavy in my hand. This signature would end a family legacy, but it would save my dignity. It was a trade-off I found increasingly necessary. My signature felt large and certain on the page. "It is done," I whispered, the weight of the action settling over me. Miss Davis took the document, her expression serious. "The process is initiated, Frank. Now, we wait for confirmation, and we prepare for the inevitable explosion." She then handed me another document, a smaller, single page. "One more thing, Frank. Regarding the house. Since Robert and Martha believe they own this property, which legally they do not, it's held by the same corporate structure. I took the liberty of drawing up a notice of termination of their occupancy agreement. I looked at the simple document. The Millers had lived in this house for 3 generations. But technically, Robert and Martha were tenants, paying a nominal rent to the holding company. "If they lose the dealership," Miss Davis explained gently, "they will certainly lose their income stream, and they may feel entitled to stay here. This document ensures they understand legally and formally that their tenancy is tied to the financial health of the Miller Group, and that tenancy will soon expire." I nodded slowly. It wasn't enough for them to lose the business. They needed to understand what it felt like to have their ground taken from under them, brick by cold brick, just as they had tried to strip away mine. I took the notice of termination. I didn't sign it yet. That was a decision for another night. A weapon I would hold close, waiting for the perfect moment. I left Miss Davis's office, knowing that the dealership was already halfway out of their grasp. The silence that night was different. It was not the silence of shame or isolation. It was the silence of a man holding a loaded cannon, waiting for the ship to sail close enough. My mind raced ahead. What would Robert say? What would Martha do? How quickly would their polite, calculated respect shatter when they learned the truth. I needed to be ready. I needed to witness it. And I knew exactly where I would be when the hammer finally dropped. The quiet hours were when I did my best. Work. Mark and Sarah assumed I was asleep by 8. They assumed I was watching old movies or just staring out the window. They had no idea I was sitting right there, across the kitchen table they bought with my money, finalizing the transfer of a lifetime of assets. They saw my trembling hands when I tried to pour coffee. They missed the steady, strong grip I had on the pen when I signed the final transfer documents. I used the lawyer in Denver, not the local firm Mark insisted on using for the dealership's small matters. The lawyer in Denver understood corporate structures that spanned decades. He understood the difference between ownership and daily operation. He understood that Mark and Sarah had been running a business that I allowed them to use, but they had forgotten who held the leash. I had given them roles. I had given them salary, authority, and prestige. I had not given them the ultimate legal control. That stayed with me, always. It took 4 days to move the paperwork. Financial structures are built to prevent impulsive transfers. But I was not being impulsive. I was being meticulous. I had built those same structures. I knew every lock, every combination, every emergency override. I knew, for example, that the 51% stake I held was not technically callable by the operating partners unless I was declared legally incompetent by a judge. They had called me clumsy. They had called me old and forgetful. But they never got the paperwork filed to declare me unfit. They were too busy enjoying the profits. That saved me. I instructed Mr. Vance, the buyer, to proceed with a quiet off-market acquisition of my 51% controlling interest. He was ecstatic. Vance had wanted my dealership for years. He thought Mark and Sarah were good operators, but he knew the dealership's true value lay in its location and its historical goodwill. Goodwill I had built. I set the closing date for the following Tuesday. Tuesday was inventory day, a chaotic day when Mark and Sarah were always distracted, counting cars and yelling at the service managers. It was the perfect distraction. Mark started to notice small things leaking around the edges of his control. A strange call from the corporate bank's regional office. A file missing from the locked office drawer. He came home complaining. "Dad, did you touch the blue ledger? The one with the shareholder notes?" he asked, throwing his briefcase onto the hall floor. I was reading the paper. The obituary section, naturally. "Blue ledger, Mark? Is that the thick one or the thin one?" I asked, feigning confusion. I made sure my voice wavered slightly. He sighed, the sound of a man burdened by an incompetent parent. "Never mind, Dad. Just stay out of the office. It's important paperwork. Financial stuff you wouldn't understand." I wouldn't understand. The dealership, the property, the loans, the payroll. All things I wouldn't understand. It was glorious. His arrogance was my greatest asset. They were so focused on the humiliation of taking my keys, the symbol of my diminished physical freedom, that they never guarded the door to my financial freedom. Sarah came in later that night, smoothing down her designer scarf. She was organizing a large charity gala at the dealership showroom, another expense I would have to cover. "Mark said you were snooping around the office today," she said, her voice dripping with careful tolerance. "I just wanted to see the pictures of the new models," I mumbled. "Mark said they were gorgeous." "They are, but the office is not a museum, Father. Please. We have important business dealings, private negotiations." I nodded slowly, looking down at my hands. "Private negotiations. Yes, I understand." I understood completely. I was in the middle of a very private, very large negotiation myself. The sale price was finalized. The escrow was funded. The paperwork was ready for the transfer of deed and title. Vance's lawyer was sharp. He insisted on a final symbolic meeting. He wanted the previous owner present when the new keys, the real keys to the company's safe and operating accounts were handed over. I needed Mark and Sarah there, not just to witness my triumph, but to understand the scale of their loss. Right in the place where they had established their kingdom, I needed to ensure they showed up on Tuesday morning. I thought about the best way to get them to the office early. It had to be irresistible. It had to be about money. Their money. I decided to use the oldest trick in the book, a perceived emergency that only the two of them could handle. I went back to the blue ledger Mark was looking for. I slipped a slightly modified, out-of-date income statement back into the folder, a statement that suggested a critical tax payment was overdue by 6 figures. It wasn't true, of course. My accountant had paid everything on time, but the statement looked genuine enough to cause panic. I left the ledger slightly ajar on my desk, positioned, so Mark would see it when he inevitably looked for it again. The trap was set. I knew he would find the ledger later that night or early Monday. He would see the overdue tax crisis and freak out. He would call Sarah. They would rush to the dealership on Tuesday morning before the bank opened, desperate to solve the financial catastrophe that didn't exist. They would be waiting for the bank manager. Instead, they would meet Mr. Vance and his lawyer. I looked out the window at the familiar lights of the neighborhood. The clock ticked past 10. I had exactly 2 days left to be the invisible, clumsy old man they pitied. 2 days left before they discovered that the only thing I was clumsy with was their future. I reached for the house phone. I needed to call Vance's secretary to confirm the Tuesday 9:30 a.m. closing. I smiled for the first time in weeks. The phone rang twice. "Hello, this is George." I kept my voice low, professional, and entirely focused. "Yes, regarding the paperwork for Tuesday, everything is in order. Tell Mr. Vance I look forward to handing over the keys." Not the car keys, the keys to the entire empire. The silence in the house that Monday morning was different. It wasn't the usual heavy silence of loneliness. It was the calm before the thunder. The documents were signed. The wire transfers were confirmed. The lawyers had sent their final notifications. Everything was done. The mechanism I had quietly built was set to trigger exactly at 10 a.m. I sat in my armchair, sipping lukewarm coffee. I listened to the sound of Daniel's car leaving the driveway. He was running late, rushing off to the dealership he assumed was his future. I watched the clock tick. 9:58, 9:59. At 10:05 a.m., my phone buzzed. It was Ms. Eleanor Vance, the lead attorney. "It is official, Mr. Peterson. The full transfer of the controlling equity interest in the auto group is complete. The new owners have been notified. The relevant managerial staff have received their standard notices." I simply said, "Thank you, Eleanor. That will be all." I hung up. I felt nothing except a strange, cool clearness. The sadness was gone. The confusion was gone. There was just the undeniable arithmetic of consequences. I went about my day normally. I did the dishes. I watered the dying fern in the entryway. I waited for the evening. When Melissa arrived home around 5, she looked harassed. She didn't speak to me, rushing straight to her wine glass. "Hard day, dear?" I asked, my voice flat. She scoffed. "You wouldn't understand, Dad. The world of business is stressful, not like retirement." I nodded slowly. "No, I suppose not." She poured a second glass. The air felt thick, ready to snap. She had no idea yet. She was just tired from a normal day. The front door slammed open around 6:30 p.m. Daniel didn't bother using the key or closing the door properly. He stormed into the living room, his face a horrifying mask of pure incandescent rage. His tie was undone. His hair was messy. He looked like a man who had just watched his entire life vanish into smoke. "You!" he roared, pointing a shaking finger at me. Melissa dropped her wine glass. It didn't shatter, but the dark crimson liquid spread instantly across the light rug. She didn't even notice. Daniel, what happened? What is wrong with you? She whispered. Daniel didn't look at her. His eyes were fixed only on me. What have you done, old man? He demanded, his voice dangerously low now. I set my teacup carefully on the coaster. I looked at the dark stain on the carpet, remembering the day Melissa insisted on buying it, saying my old furniture was clumsy next to the modern design. I have no idea what you are referring to, Daniel. Did you have a difficult day at work? He took 2 enormous strides forward. He was towering over me, breathing hard. Don't play the idiot. Don't you dare play the clumsy old man with me right now. Ah, I said, the dealership. The calmness of my voice stunned both of them into momentary silence. Daniel's chest was heaving. The company-wide memo, the emergency board meeting, the liquidation notice. Who the hell is Odyssey Acquisitions? Why did they buy the controlling interest in the auto group this morning? Melissa gasped, clutching her throat. Buy? Daniel, what are you saying? You mean the ownership changed? Daniel wheeled on her. Ownership didn't just change, Melissa. The majority shareholder sold his stake. The new group just notified us that the current management structure is redundant and subject to immediate restructuring. They froze all internal accounts. My office security badge didn't even work 10 minutes ago. He spun back to me. That stake was held by a blind trust, a silent, non-voting bloc. It never moved. It was just a capital reserve. I nodded pleasantly. It was. My initial investment, decades ago, when your grandfather helped me start the business. I never used those shares. They just sat there, accumulating value. They were my safety net. Your safety net? Daniel shrieked. That stake was what provided the capital leverage for our expansion. It's the entire foundation of the current group's value. If you sell that, you sell everything we built. You sold everything I built, son, I corrected him softly. I just retrieved the foundation. Melissa stepped forward, her face pale white. She was starting to connect the dots I had laid out over the past few days. Dad, you own that trust? All this time? Yes, Melissa. I always kept it separate. Your father-in-law here was too busy counting the cars in the showroom to ever look into the real structure of the business. He only knew about the parts he needed to manage. Daniel looked lost. His fury was curdling into fear and disbelief. But why? Why would you liquidate the cornerstone of your own legacy? You just destroyed your son's entire career. Everything I worked for. Yes, I did, I agreed. I sold it quickly, cleanly, and for a handsome sum that is now resting safely in an account far from here, only accessible by me. I leaned forward in my chair. The movement was slow, deliberate. I looked him dead in the eye, savoring the moment. You want to know why, Daniel? Let's talk about clumsiness. I paused, letting the word hang heavy in the air. Do you remember 3 weeks ago? That Thursday afternoon. I asked you for help with the taxes. I asked you to run a small errand for me, perhaps drive me to the bank. Daniel swallowed hard, his face glistening with sweat. And you looked at your wife, and you laughed. You told her that the old man is getting too clumsy to handle the keys. You said my reflexes were short. You decided, along with your wife, that you would confiscate my mobility because you deemed me incompetent. Melissa instantly jumped in, her fear finally giving way to a defensive screech. That was for your safety, Dad. We were worried. It wasn't an insult. Oh, but it was, Melissa, I stated. It was a dismissal. It was a clear statement that my autonomy was less valuable than your perceived convenience. You took the keys to my car, which I bought with my own money, and you handed me a bus pass like I was a child. You humiliated me in my own home. I looked back at Daniel. You called me clumsy. You took my keys. It made me realize that you saw me as an obstacle to be managed, not a father to be respected. You treated my dignity like an asset you could strip away whenever you felt like it. My voice was quiet now, but it commanded the room. So, I decided to show you exactly what true clumsiness looks like, Daniel. Real clumsiness is selling the controlling interest in the company that provides your entire lifestyle without telling you. He staggered back, tripping slightly over the wine stain. You sold my career because I took your keys, he whispered aghast. Are you serious? Over a set of car keys? No, I corrected him patiently. I sold your career because you showed me that you believed you had the right to diminish my life. The keys were just the indicator. They were the small transaction that proved the massive deficit in your character. And I realized that if you could so easily take the keys to my car, you would eventually try to take the keys to my house, my bank account, and the rest of my freedom. You are insane, Melissa yelled. You just made your son unemployed. We have a mortgage. We have 2 children heading to college. I am perfectly sane, I countered. I am merely capable of defending myself. And as for your children and your mortgage, those are your problems now. You wanted independence from my guidance, Daniel. Congratulations. You have it. Daniel slowly sank onto the edge of the sofa, running his hands through his hair. He was defeated, and he knew it. What are we supposed to do? He asked, the rage completely gone, replaced by a hollow desperation I had never seen in him. You are supposed to find a new job, Daniel, I said, shrugging slightly. The severance package from Odyssey Acquisitions should last you a few months. Use that time wisely. But the house, Melissa cried, gesturing wildly around the expensive, immaculate living room. You have to help us. You have to undo this. Call the lawyers. Buy it back. I shook my head. No, Melissa. The funds are already diversified, and I have no intention of undoing anything. This is justice, cold, clean, and delivered precisely when you least expected it. I stood up. I walked past the shocked silence of my son and daughter-in-law. You know, I won't need that bus pass anymore either. I walked toward the coat closet. I pulled out a small worn leather duffel bag I had packed 2 days prior.